last night, Israel indicated to Hamas that Israel is done waiting, and that if Hamas doesn't release hostages, then Israel will go back to fighting and to fight at a different level of intensity against Hamas in order to persuade Hamas to actually hand over the hostages. That's one thing happening. Second thing is that during this unofficial ceasefire that has been going on for quite a while, Hamas has also prepared. They have recruited new combatants and trained them. They have scavenged explosives from the battlefield, and they have smuggled in weapons, assault rifles, and other types of weapons, and they have been planning attacks against Israel. And last night's Israeli strikes were also a preemptive strike against Hamas military commanders and against their infrastructure in order to prevent them the ability to launch an attack on Israel again. And it's something that Israel is saying, that we are going to learn from our past mistakes. We're not going to wait for Hamas to have the ability and to be able to plan attacks against Israel ever again. And if we see them taking such steps, then we take action before. Well, we can say that the negotiations are ongoing now with different means, with military means. I think that Israel is still leaving the door open for negotiations, and I think that Israel ultimately wants Hamas to negotiate and to release hostages. The aim here is to release Israeli hostages held in Hamas captivity, brutal, torturous Hamas captivity for almost a year and a half. That is the primary objective of Israel, to get them home. And if Hamas now would signal to Israel that they're ready to release hostages, then I'm sure Israel would respond by de-escalating military. But if Hamas doesn't signal that, and if they continue to hold on and refuse to release hostages, then I think Israel will escalate matters and to expand military operations. Currently, it is only based on air operations, but I would very likely see the expansion into ground operations and special forces operating all over the Gaza Strip. I think Hamas wants to eat the cake and have it. And I think Hamas is relying on Egyptian, Arab, and European support for the Egyptian proposal, which was a counter proposal to President Trump's directives and idea of evacuating the Gaza Strip and rebuilding it. Sadly, Hamas is emboldened by the Egyptian counteroffer. And when I've read the Egyptian counteroffer, I am very much saddened by it, because what that statement is, it's basically keeping Hamas in place, not forcing them to pay a price for the acts of aggression against Israel, for murdering Israelis, for abducting 251 Israelis, and for bringing havoc and destruction upon the Gaza Strip. What the Egyptians are essentially doing is allowing Hamas to stay in power under a certain disguise of a new Palestinian government, but that can't fool anybody. The Egyptian proposal will keep Hamas in place, and when Hamas sees that proposal, they say, well, all we have to do is to play a waiting game, because we have the support of Arabs, Egyptians, and some of the Europeans. And I think that is the main reason why they feel that they are strong enough not to release additional Israeli hostages. I think that what we will see next round is the IDF fighting, but fighting with its gloves off. Before, the IDF wasn't only fighting with gloves on, but it was forced to fight with only one arm. This time around, I think due to the different political international environment, Israel will be fighting with both hands and legs, and it won't be drawing any punches. It'll be very strong, decisive, and kinetic activity that will apply tremendous pressure on Hamas and on everything that supports Hamas. And the aim will be to totally dismantle Hamas as a military and political organization, and to get the hostages back. And hopefully it'll be much swifter than the type of combat that the IDF was forced to conduct for about a year and 2 months under international constraints and under limitations by our friends and allies. And hopefully we'll be able to fight swifter, better, and a more decisive type of fighting that also hopefully will alleviate the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza and hopefully will allow them out of the Gaza Strip so that they can find a safer and better place to stay while the fighting is ongoing. It's important to understand why that's needed, because for a year and 2 months, a year and 3 months, Israel fought against Hamas and it applied some level of force against Hamas, but it was prevented from applying all different tools at its disposal against an enemy. And for the war between Hamas and Israel, it's the first one in history that I'm aware of that a party to a conflict, a combatant side, Israel in this case, was forced to provide food, fuel, and water and medical supplies to its enemy in combat, knowing that those provisions were used by its enemy to sustain its operations. And nevertheless, Israel was forced to do so. And it's also the first time in military history, and I would happily be corrected if anybody of our viewers knows differently, but it's the first time that I'm aware that civilians were prevented from fleeing the battlefield. Palestinian civilians who didn't want to be in Gaza, who wanted to flee the dangerous environment, were prevented from doing so by Hamas and by the Egyptians. And I think that is a travesty. And I think that the Egyptian authorities should be held accountable for Palestinian blood, suffering, and killing. Now, what's different now? There's a different US administration that sees eye to eye with Israel in understanding the complex military challenge that is posed by Hamas, by the fact that Hamas relies on using human shields as their strategy, abusing civilians as their human shields, and abusing the civilian infrastructure, schools, mosques, UN centers, and many other places that Hamas has been using in order to hide away from the IDF. And the understanding in the US is that that is not okay. And the US isn't going to stop Israel from fighting against Hamas and, most importantly, defeating Hamas. Now, defeating Hamas is a good thing. It's a good thing for Israel and it's a good thing for Palestinians. It's a good thing for the region. And the sooner Hamas will be defeated, the sooner Gaza can go back to rebuilding, and then we can start to pave a path towards a prosperous and safe and respectful future for Gazans. But as long as Hamas is in power, held in power by the Egyptians and by certain European countries that continue to contribute money, as long as that is the situation, then suffering and misery and death will be the future of Gaza. The moment Hamas is removed by force and then by a complementary political structure, that will be the new day for Gaza, and that is when the things will start to change, hopefully for the better. No, I think the attack was the Israeli strike was a response to Hamas's refusal to continue negotiations and release hostages, and also an imminent threat that Israel detected on the Gazan side, where we could see Hamas preparing to launch an attack against Israel. So those were the two key parameters. I understand that, the talks between Jerusalem and Washington are ongoing. They are intense, they are intimate, and they are very focused, where we see things eye to eye, almost everything. And I think that Israeli authorities had all the backing that they needed even before this, and that even, President Trump has said so long time ago. He has insinuated that, if Israel should do what it needs to do, and if Hamas doesn't return all of the hostages immediately, then there will be hell to pay. And he's also insinuated that, if I was in charge of Israeli decisions, I maybe would have acted differently, which in my mind is a thinly veiled criticism and asking the Israelis do more and do it faster because you have all the runway that you need from the United States of America. I fear that Hamas will take punitive action against hostages, that they will murder or execute or add to their torture. It fills me with a lot of fear for their well-being. They're already suffering in tremendous, horrible conditions, and I fear that Hamas will use this as a pretext in order to do even more heinous crimes against humanity against our hostages. I hope that Israeli troops will be able to get to these hostages once ground operations start and rescue them. But yes, I do share that concern. However, I think that we don't have a lot of choices because we've seen Hamas's refusal to negotiate. We've seen their refusal to release hostages, and we understand that they are emboldened by Egyptian and European support. And as such, we have to do different things in order to get our people home. But I very much understand the concern of the hostages and their families. I wish that our people will be brought back home as quickly as possible. And every moment that goes by, we should be supporting the hostage families and share their quest for the return of their loved ones. Hamas has acknowledged that it's a few seniors, military and administrative key officials that have been killed, and quite a lot of infrastructure has been struck as well. And the IDF is conducting BDA, battle damage assessment, as we speak, assessing the damage affected to Hamas and preparing the next salvo or sortie of attacks on Hamas, collecting intelligence, using a lot of intelligence that has been generated over this ceasefire, including, I would assume, the location of hostages, the location of senior Hamas commanders, and more important, stockpiles of weapons and other things. So there are a lot of moving parts. Many interesting things are happening. I hope Hamas will listen and that they will come back to the negotiating table and release Israeli hostages, all of them, and to do so immediately. That is the only way that the Gaza Strip can be spared from a coming Israeli assault on Hamas, which will be swift, it'll be harsh, and it'll be different from what Hamas faced over a year and 2 months.